seeing as Chanukah is coming, like it or not, it's about to happen. And we have a few weeks to go till Chanukah, but I thought that it would be nice for us to study something that relates to Chanukah, and hopefully will give us enough time between now and Chanukah to be able to complete it. So that's the goal, that's the objective. By way of introduction, what we're going to talk about today is a lesson that, today, over the next few weeks, is a lesson that relates Chanukah to the principle of peace in the home, okay? So, of course, we know that the great symbolism of Chanukah is the lights of Chanukah. We're going to do a comparison based on the teachings of the Rambam, halachic teaching of the Rambam, about Shabbos candles and Chanukah candles, and the Rebbe's explanation of the two. It's very beautiful, and it's got a great lesson for us. So let's jump straight into it. Besiyum Hilchos Chanukah. At the conclusion of the laws of Chanukah, so what do we see? Says the Rambam, Zok the Rambam, Hoya lefonov ner beisoy vener Chanukah. Okay, so this is when you got budgetary dilemmas. If you've got a budgetary dilemma over Chanukah, what's the budgetary dilemma? So he says like this: what happens if a person's got to make a choice? Ner beisoy vener Chanukah. Either you can afford to have Shabbos candles, or you can afford to have Chanukah candles. Another example: Oi ner beisoy v'kiddush hayoim. Or let's say it's not Chanukah. Let's say it's an ordinary Shabbos, and you've got a similar budgetary dilemma. Do I spend money to get wine to be able to make kiddush, or do I spend money to have candles in order to light Shabbos candles? Now that's a more interesting dilemma in a sense, because both of them are for Shabbos. Kiddush wine is for Shabbos, and candles are for Shabbos. So you might think that that's a little bit more of a tricky dilemma. In any event, what we're seeing over here is that the Rambam describes a toss-up between Shabbos candles and another alternative obligation that you have at the same time. So which do you choose? Nu? Let's hear. You can use the chat if you want to share. Which do you choose? Shabbos candles or Kiddush wine? Shabbos candles or Chanukah candles? Which one takes preference? Let's say which one takes precedence according to Torah law. What would you say? Right, you got to render an halachic decision over here. So which one do you say? Shabbos candles or Chanukah candles? Shabbos candles or Kiddush wine? Which one? Okay, so we have a vote over here for Shabbos candles. 2 for Shabbos candles. 3 for Shabbos candles, and you would be absolutely correct. 4 for Shabbos candles, and that is the correct answer, as you're going to see in the words of the Rambam now. But the interesting thing is not which one takes precedence, as much as why it takes precedence. So what does the Rambam say? Ner beisoy koidem mishum shloim beisoy. Says the Rambam, what is the reason that we give precedence to Shabbos candles? Because the reason that you have Shabbos candles is to bring peace into your home. So did you know that? Did you know that that was the reason why you have Shabbos candles? To bring peace into your home? Most people don't know that. So let's just go back a second. Once upon a time, there used to be no electricity. And I'm not talking about South Africa and our stable or not so stable electricity supply. Once upon a time, people didn't have electric light. And so it's brought in the Gemara, and the Rambam talks about it as well, and eventually it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch as bottom line Jewish law, that you won't have a nice Shabbos if your house is dark. Can you imagine? You come back from shul, it's already, Shabbos by definition means it's after dark. So you come back on Friday night and you sit down to a meal and it's pitch black. So therefore they mandated that you should have Shabbos candles in order to have shalom bayis, and in order to have peace in your home. That it'd be a nice experience. People can enjoy themselves, you can talk, you can interact, you can do all those wonderful things that we say Shabbos is renowned for, which you would be unable to do in the dark. That's the reason, the motivation that the Rambam gives, why Shabbos candles take precedence over Kiddush wine and over Chanukah candles. But he doesn't stop there. And the fact that he doesn't stop there is going to be a matter of interest for us. So he continues, Sheharei Hashem nimchak lasi shalom bein ish liishtoi. You want to know how important peace within a family is to God? Here we'll illustrate an example. So he says that Hashem allows us to erase his name in order to bring peace. The backstory of that is that there's a very interesting law within Judaism which is called the law of a soita. What's a soita? It's a very unfortunate situation. There's obviously a breakdown in the relationship between a husband and a wife. And it reaches a point where the husband is suspicious of his wife's fidelity. And he figures that his wife is hanging out too much with a particular individual and something's not so kosher over there. So he warns her. And he says, if I ever hear from reliable witnesses that you and that guy have been alone in a secluded environment, I'm taking you to the courts. Anyhow, apparently she disregards his warning. And she lands up spending time secluded with witnesses who see this happen with this particular guy. So the process then is called the soita process. The man has to take his wife to Jerusalem to face the highest court. And they try as best they can to encourage her to come clean on what's really happened. Let's assume that she digs her heels in and says, I've done nothing wrong. My husband is crazy, he's hypervigilant. There's nothing going on over here. So then they say, well, the only way to clear your name is you go through this process, the soita process, which involves bringing a mincha flour offering and drinking a concoction. Now, the nature of this concoction is that they write a piece of the Torah on parchment. That piece contains Hashem's name. And the Kohanim then have to dissolve the ink that includes Hashem's name into this water that also has some of the sand from the floor of the base. I mean, it's a weird concoction. And then she has to drink it. If she is guilty, she and the fellow with whom she had this affair would both die in a very strange and excruciating way. And if she is innocent, then her life becomes a beautiful blessing from there on. She doesn't suffer childbirth, her children are healthy. There's a whole string of brachas that come her way. In other words, here you've got a man who could possibly be controlling. He could possibly be paranoid. We don't know exactly what's going on over here. And there's unfounded or unproven, let's say, it might be founded, unproven suspicion of his wife's conduct. So Hashem mandates a law in the Torah that says you take the name of God and you dissolve the name of God in water. Now, under ordinary circumstances, that is a major offense in Judaism. You're not allowed to erase Hashem's name. Even if it's only part of Hashem's name, you wouldn't be allowed to erase it. That's why we have reams of paper that people collect over time that have content with Hashem's name, and they don't know what to do with it because you can't throw it out, you can't burn it, and you can't destroy it, so you have to take it, and you have to bury it. It's like a whole process. And here Hashem encourages us dafka to erase his name in order to try to re-establish peace within this family. From that, the Rambam derives that the most important value we have as Jewish people in our homes is the value of peace. And if you've got a toss-up between Shabbos candles that represent peace and another mitzvah that might represent miracles like the Chanukah story, or the sanctification of Shabbos like the wine of Kiddush, that gets overridden by peace, because peace is that important. Beautiful lesson, don't you think? Beautiful lesson. And it doesn't stop there either. Even though by now the Rambam has departed from his normal tradition. Usually the way that the Rambam speaks in the Mishnah Torah, which is an encyclopedia of Jewish law, is to the point. This is the law, move on. He doesn't generally give us explanations why this is the law. And here we see in this particular case that he not only gives the explanation, but he almost seems to belabor the point. This is the law, and you have to understand it, and in case you didn't get it, I'm going to say it again. This is what's so special about peace. So look what he says now. Godoil hashalom. Peace is great. Shekol haTorah nitna la'asoi shalom ba'olam. That the entire purpose of why Torah was given in the world was only to bring peace to the world. Isn't that fascinating? Most people think, why was the Torah given to the world? In order that we should be frum. In order that people should become religiously observant. Yes, that is part of what the Torah teaches us, obviously, how to become an observant Jew. But why was the Torah given? To introduce peace to the world, to infuse the world with peace. And he proves it from a pasuk, Shenemar, as the pasuk says, the pasuk says, the verse says, that its ways, the ways of the Torah, are pleasant, and all of its pathways are peace. So there you have it. Not only do we learn a law about Shabbos over here, and that Shabbos is a time of peace, and by the way, that's something to think about, that the nature, the atmosphere, the overarching sentiment of Shabbos should be peace. But besides that, in addition to that, it's important for us to understand that the whole of Judaism is predicated on the pursuit of peace. Now we're going to analyze this, but before we do, let's scale back a step and discover where the Rambam originally found this principle. The Mokum von der Halacha is in Masechta Shabbos, aber dort steht nur ner beisei adif mishum shaloim beisei. So the Rambam can track back his source, because just understand how these things work. So in Judaism, you only really have the right to comment if you can prove that your comment is founded on an original teaching within Torah. So you and I could write books as much as we want from now to whenever, and nobody has to recognize the validity of our writings, because if we cannot trace them back to original sources, they might just be thumbsuck. And that even applies to the Rambam. The Rambam was this incredible scholar, so much so that they say about him, and it's written on his tombstone, Mi Moshe vad Moshe loy kom ke Moshe, that there was nobody as great as Moshe since the original Moshe till Moshe ben Maimon, which is the name of the Rambam, the person who was called Anesher HaGadol, the great eagle, because he was such an incredible teacher and such an incredible codifier. Still, the rules are the same. He has to be able to track back to an original source. So what's the original source of the Rambam? You go back to the Talmud in the tractate Shabbos, and it says the same thing, but apparently more succinctly. There the Gemara just simply says, Ner beisoy adif mishum shaloim beisoy, that if you've got a toss-up between the Shabbos candles and the Chanukah candles, or between the Shabbos candles and the Kiddush wine, you prioritize the Shabbos candles. Why? Because of peace in your home. End of story. So what we're going to do now is we're going to raise a series of questions on the way in which the Rambam has put together this particular law. So we're not questioning what the law is. We accept it. Shabbos candles trump everything else. And we accept the principle behind it, that it's because of peace. But we're going to analyze the way in which the Rambam presents it, and how come it is different to the way in which the Gemara presents it. And based on that, we'll derive some lessons. So, darf men verstehen, we need to understand the following. Was ist machriach dem Rambam zu Mosif seiner Reihe, shara Hashem nimcha klase shalom chule? Usually, as a rule of thumb, if one book quotes another book as its source, so you'll see this, for example, in the commentary on Rashi, when Rashi comments on the verses of the Torah, and he quotes Midrash or he quotes the Talmud, the same principle we're about to explore will apply to Rashi. It's exactly the same principle with the Rambam as well. You usually expect that if you quote a source, you try and stay as close to the original wording as possible. That's usually how it works. So if the Rambam wants to quote the Gemara, where the Gemara says that your Shabbos candles take priority over your Chanukah candles or your Kiddush wine, and that's where the Gemara leaves it, then you would expect the Rambam to do the same. So our first question is, why does the Rambam add information? And what's the information that he adds specifically? I'll prove it to you. I'll prove to you that peace is so important. Because look, Hashem was willing to allow us to raise his name for the sake of peace. Why do we need the proof? Okay? And even more specifically, what we need to understand is, was noch der Reihe, shari Hashem v'chulei, is noch mois v'nayim inin, Gadol hashalom shekol ha'Torah nitna chulei. Now, if that already raised an eyebrow, hey, hang on a second. Rambam, you're quoting the Gemara that says that the Shabbos candles take priority. Why do you add a proof that the Gemara did not feel was necessary to put there? Look how important peace is, because Hashem is willing to allow us to raise his name. But that's not where it ended. The Rambam apparently then goes off on a tangent, and he starts telling us how important peace is, and how the Torah was given for the sake of peace. This is not an essay. It's not a novel. It's not a book of philosophy. This is a book of law. And the nature of a book of law is, you state the law and you move on. That's how books of law work. I mean, surely, think about it yourself. If you wanted to know, what am I supposed to do as a Jewish person in a particular stage of whatever. Let's say, how am I supposed to keep Shabbos? What do you want? You want a guide that says, do this and don't do that. You don't want a guide that says, do this, which reminds me of the fact that we have this principle, which is actually really interesting, and it's beautiful, by the way. The concept that the Torah was given for the sake of peace is a beautiful concept. It's something that we should really parade around town and we should announce from the rooftops. But what's it got to do with law? And what's it got to do with this law? This is the law of how you work out which one you're going to use. Shabbos candles or Kiddush wine. Shabbos candles or Chanukah candles. That's it. Why do we have to get into this whole interesting discussion about the importance of peace? Now, sometimes what happens is you come up with a question like this and you feel compelled to give an answer. You ever have that feeling where somebody asks a question and it's a really good question, you feel kind of put under pressure and sure, I better come up with an answer. So straight away, he's going to tell us in parentheses over here that maybe you think the Rambam wanted to say this for a particular reason. We'll show how that reason is not applicable in this particular case. So he says in brackets, V'doich ha-godol loymar, as the tam was the Rambam is moisif lebasoif, godol ha-sholem chulei, is kedei lesayem bedovar toiv. Okay, here's a possible answer that you might have suggested. We have a principle in Judaism which says that whenever you talk, whenever you teach, whatever it is that you present, always try and end on a positive note. And that's why if you have a look in classical Jewish works, they work quite hard, the authors work quite hard to always end things on a positive note. Even in the Torah itself, the Torah portion, most of the time will dafka end on a positive note. And it's not all of the time, but it's a rule that you can expect to see frequently throughout Torah, right? You always end on a positive note. And by the way, you'll even see that there are people sometimes in history who had to address very difficult topics that were very upsetting, topics that were controversial, topics that perhaps made people feel uncomfortable. And the bottom line is there was no nice way to end it. The correspondence, the letter, the ruling, the whatever it was, there was no nice way to end it. So what they would write at the end is these two words, u'mesayimim b'toiv, which means, and we conclude with something positive, even though that's the only positivity. You're just saying we conclude with something positive. So maybe that's what the Rambam wanted to do over here. He's concluding the laws of Chanukah, so it's the end of a section. And generally speaking, at the end of a section, the Rambam always wants to give us something upbeat and something positive. So there you got it. Here's the upbeat, positive message that peace is a good thing, and peace is the purpose of Torah, and therefore you should know this, take it home, beyond just the scope of Chanukah. Why is that not a good answer? Let's see. Can anybody suggest why that might not be a good enough explanation? Because he wants to end on a positive note. That's why the Rambam included this expression about the greatness of peace, because he wants to end on a positive note. Why is that? Why do you think that's not a compelling reason? Why do you think that's insufficient as an explanation for this particular wording? You know what they say, the problem is when you engage with people in a virtual environment, so you can't see if people have the answer or not. You kind of got to wait to see if anybody's got a response. Okay, there we go. Somebody says maybe it's too open-ended. But here we go. There was nothing negative before. And an interesting question, does the Rambam do this with all halachas? It's actually an interesting question. Maybe we can just, for half a second, just talk about that. So basically, the Rambam divided his work into 14 volumes, and each volume is on a particular theme. And yes, at the end of each volume, which is not at the end of each set of halachas, but at the end of a whole volume which has had various subjects, then the Rambam typically will include a lesson that is a positive take-home message. So for example, we're about to, in the daily Rambam schedule, we're about to round off the book of Kedusha, which is the laws of forbidden relationships and the laws of forbidden foods. So the very last law that he teaches over there is the mitzvah called Kisoy Hadam, which is that if you shecht certain animals or birds, you have to cover their blood with sand. So he says, here's the positive take-home message, that even though it's just blood and even though it's sand, you might think that you could kick the blood with your foot over the sand. You actually have to take it with your hand, because a mitzvah is an acknowledgement of the fact that Hashem runs the world. So there's an example. There are many other examples, and there are occasions where he does it at the end of a halacha. But the bigger issue over here is he didn't say anything negative. He ended on a positive note. Look what he said. The very last thing that the Rambam said before this was that Hashem was willing to allow us to erase his name. Why? To bring peace between husband and wife. Bringing peace between husband and wife is a positive message. So you can't tell me that the only reason the Rambam wanted to remind us now how important peace is and that the Torah was given for the sake of peace is only because he needed a positive spin at the end of the section. He already had a positive spin. But you're going to say, you're going to say, whoa, hang on a second. We're talking then not just about bringing peace between husband and wife. We're talking about erasing Hashem's name. Maybe erasing Hashem's name is a negative thing. Maybe that's why he had to kind of, soften it by talking about the importance of peace. So if you're worried about that, says the Rebbe, he could have fiddled with the wording in such a way to ensure that the part that's not, so to speak, right at the end is the part about erasing Hashem's name. Either way you look at it, to try and justify it, the Rambam talking about the greatness of peace as a general principle and as the purpose of the whole Torah is not a good enough explanation for why he had to insert it here. So we have two questions. If the Rambam bases himself on the Gemara, why then does he speak with different language to what the Gemara used? Number two, why does he talk about what appears to be a tangent, the value of peace as a principle, when you're actually talking about the laws of your Shabbos candles? Now, if you think that we're finished with the questions, we're not. You see, if you really want to understand something properly, the key to understanding a concept is first to break it apart and then to reconstruct it. Unfortunately, what usually happens with people is people ask a question and then they're kind of on the edge of their seat waiting for an answer. And that puts pressure on the person who wants to give the answer to say, okay, I'm going to satisfy you now. Don't worry, I'm going to give you the answer. And often what happens then is you get a short answer that does not necessarily fully satisfy the question. And so the question comes back at some point in the future. The correct way to learn something is to say, if we have some questions over here, perhaps our entire understanding of the whole piece is missing something. So let's take it apart bit by bit. And once we've deconstructed the whole discussion, then we can put the pieces back together again and they'll make sense. So we're not done with the questions over here. We actually have other quite important questions that we have to raise on the Rambam's comments. So just so you see where that puts us, that is on the second column over here, the last paragraph of the second column, which is marked with the letter Beis. Euch darf men verstehen. Furthermore, we have to answer the following questions. Question 1. Die Etzem Raya. The Rambam brought a proof to illustrate to us that peace in the home is such an important value. What was the proof? Because we erase Hashem's name in order to facilitate peace between a husband and wife. Let's read it. Let's analyze it. Let's see. Wimmer lernt in Pashtus meint der Rambam herausbringen mit Share Hashem nimcha klasi shalom dem Goydel Malas Hashalom. At face value, and the way we've explained it till now, the way that we have learned this piece so far, basically what the Rambam's done is he said, wow, look how important peace is. So important, it allows you the right to erase Hashem's name. As es is doich afilan inin hachi chamor in Torah mitzvahs mechikas Hashem is mikol sheken as ner beisoi is doichen ner Chanukah. So it seems that the Rambam's giving us a simple logical process. And the logical process goes like this. Okay, so I've got here peace in the home, and I've got here a terrible violation of Judaism called erasing Hashem's name. One of the most serious things that you could ever do. Remember, the 10 commandments say don't take Hashem's name in vain. That's, in other words, don't use Hashem's name in vain. Now, the concept of erasing Hashem's name is learned from a different part of the Torah, but still, the principle of actively erasing Hashem's name is an incredible violation. So, peace in the home versus erasing Hashem's name. And we see that peace in the home overrides it. So now, peace in the home, or a rabbinic law to commemorate the miracle of Chanukah. Again, erasing Hashem's name is one of the core principles of the Torah itself. And that gets overridden by peace in the home. So definitely, by logical extrapolation, definitely Chanukah, which is only a rabbinic law, surely is overridden by the mitzvah to have peace in your home, which is the Shabbos candles. So that's the logic, right? Got it? That's the logic. Now that we understand the logic, and it's pretty much what we would call a Kal Vachomer logical presentation, where a Kal Vachomer basically says, if this is true in the serious case, it is definitely true in the less serious case, or vice versa, depending on how you want to construct it. So in other words, if I have the power to override the serious case, I definitely have the power to override the less serious case. If I have the power to override a law in the Torah, I have the power to override a rabbinic festival called Chanukah. That's the logic. Now let's test if the logic works. But when you really analyze it, you can ask yourself the question, are we comparing apples with apples? Let's have a look. Lasei shalom bein ish leishtoi benegea asoita retzich wegen matter sein isha leweile. A shalom was is neged den kiem von chaya mishpacha und schchina shruya beineim. And we'll look at some of the other things that he says in a moment. Let's compare the two. Are we comparing apples with apples? The stakes in the Sota case are really high. Because if this thing doesn't go well, that family disintegrates. That means to say, let's assume there are a few scenarios that could play out. Scenario number one, she absolutely denies all of the allegations, drinks the water, and in fact is guilty. What happens? Their family gets destroyed. She dies. Let's assume that she has children. Those children are now orphaned. He, the man she messed around with, he dies, and his family is affected by it. It's an absolute disaster. Let's say she comes clean. Let's say she says, you're right, moment of weakness, and I was having an affair. Family's destroyed. Family's destroyed. They have to divorce. She does not get the reparations of a ksuba. There are limitations on who she could marry going forward in the future. She can never get together with the other guy who she had the affair with. Total disaster. Let's say, for whatever reason, they can't get her to Jerusalem and they can never test this. What's going to happen? Family's going to fall apart because there's going to be so much stress between the husband and wife. He's constantly going to accuse her. She's constantly going to deny it. And you're going to have the spiraling implosion of their relationship. So look how much good this Sota water can achieve if it proves her innocent. Look how much tension it can alleviate. Look how it can restore somebody's faith. I mean, it's an incredible thing. And from us, as a from a Jewish perspective, if a family unit remains whole, then Hashem is present over there. You hear that? This is not just about defending the woman against her husband's allegations. This is about keeping Hashem in the space. So we're erasing Hashem's name in order, so to speak, to keep Hashem in the space. Here's another point to consider. Right at the end of the paragraph. There's an incredibly powerful comment that our sages make, that if a person divorces his first wife, the altar in the temple cries. That's how devastating the collapse of a marriage is. That the altar, which is there to represent purity and atonement and forgiveness, cries over the loss of a Jewish household. So do you see what's at stake over here? Do you see what we are playing with? Is Mikol Hai Taimer Now, if you've got all of this riding on the process, maybe the family can be preserved, maybe the divine presence can be retained, maybe we can prevent the Mizbeach crying. There are so many things riding on this. Actually, when you think about it logically, erasing Hashem's name suddenly doesn't sound like such a devastating choice. You're effectively erasing the written form of his name in order to protect his presence. You're going to keep him, so to speak, in the environment. Now let's compare that to Shabbos candles. Are Shabbos candles as dramatic as that? I mean, the Shabbos candles are beautiful, of course, we know that. You know, they add such luster to our Shabbos experience. But are they as dramatic as that? Can we argue Shabbos candles are going to hold families from disintegration? Yes, they probably will, actually. Reminds me of a story I heard quite a number of years ago about a couple that was having marital conflict. And they came to a particular rabbi, Chabad rabbi in the United States. And they asked him for some advice on what they should do. And he said, you want to preserve your marriage, start to keep Shabbos. Anyhow, they were furious. Typical rabbi, you know, taking advantage of the fact that we are vulnerable at the moment and trying to push his religious agenda on us. Anyhow, they had a shtickle fallout, as we say, a faribel. They didn't want to speak to that rabbi for a period of time. Anyhow, years later, they meet up again, and the rabbi is very pleased to discover that they're still married. So he says, please tell me, how did you hold it together? You were in such a bad state when you came to see me those years ago. How did you hold it together? They said, we went for therapy. And we found a fantastic relationship therapist, and he, she, whatever, helped us right through it. So the rabbi says, well, what you know, there had to be something. What was the secret? What was the secret that held it all together? So they said, the thing that worked for us is the therapist recommended that once a week we should sit down to a candlelit dinner together. That's what helped. That's what helped. That's what held us together. I don't know what the rabbi did or didn't say to them, but that's the point. Yes, can Shabbos candles preserve a marriage? Absolutely yes. But nobody's going to ever suggest that lighting Shabbos candles comes anywhere near to the drama of the Sota experience in the hope that we can salvage a marriage that is absolutely at the end. So Mashenkin the Shalom by Ner Beisoi. So if you have a look in the original sources, what is the peace in the home that is generated by having Shabbos candles? Was kommt not zu verhitten shlo yikashel beitze beeven oder balbnei beisim mit starin leisha bechoshech. There are different answers that are given, different suggestions that are given by different commentaries. One commentary says it's simply that you don't bump into the furniture. That's the shalom bias. It's a peaceful home environment if you can navigate your way through your own dining room without bumping into chairs and tables and, you know, whatever. And the other opinion is to keep your family happy, because nobody likes to sit in the dark, and I don't have to convince you of that. Any person who's a resident of South Africa will know very well how much we hate sitting in the dark. So is my raya as der shalom soll durch sein an ander mitzvah befragt bersummenisse von ner Chanukah. So how do we know logically that the peace in the home that you'll create by having Shabbos candles is in fact strong enough to override another mitzvah, the candles of Chanukah, which actually, if you think about it, are a declaration of faith in Hashem? Because Chanukah commemorates an incredible miracle, and by us lighting the Chanukah candles, we're making a public statement. In fact, that's one of the core issues of lighting Chanukah candles, is Pirsume Nisa, to make a public statement that Hashem runs the world and Hashem does miracles, and He did this miracle for us. So that's a really interesting perspective. Initially, we thought it was a no-brainer. What a brilliant proof. Obviously, if you can erase Hashem's name, obviously it overrides Chanukah candles. But it's not so obvious. The logic has to work. And the logic apparently does not seem to work. Because saving a marriage in crisis does not seem to be the same as making sure you have a pleasant Shabbos dinner. And that's so important we can discard the mitzvah of Chanukah. Question number 2. Okay, so this is the last in our series of questions. We'll then kind of have to summarize our questions. Question number 2. In dem etzem din is the Rambam mekatzer umeshane from the Shoina Gemara. Besides the fact that we've already identified that the Rambam words his proofs of the importance of peace differently to how his source, the Gemara, worded it, and that was an issue for us. The truth is that the way that the Rambam words the actual laws is also different to how the Gemara says it, and we need to understand why. Why does he make that distinction? Now, for a person who's not familiar with these things and you don't typically learn Rambam or Rashi or whatever, you think, big deal. Okay, so you didn't quote exactly. But in Torah, it is a big deal, because if you're a Torah source and you're quoting a Torah source, the expectation is that you will quote as close to the authentic original as possible. So anytime that doesn't happen, it raises an eyebrow. We have to understand why. So we're going to see two distinctions between the wording in the Gemara and the wording that the Rambam uses. Number one, in Gemara is das in zwei Fallen. Ner Beisai v'ner Chanukah, ner Beisai adif mishum shloim Beisai, ner Beisai v'kiddush hayoim, ner Beisai adif mishum shloim Beisai. And the Rambam is a beide koilel in ein bava. The first distinction, which, for, like I say, for most people, if you're not familiar with the style and the approach of these classic works, you'll probably think, oh, you're splitting hairs. But the first distinction is interesting. The Gemara talks about Shabbos candles versus Chanukah candles in a self-contained conversation that ends with Shabbos candles override Chanukah candles because peace in the home is the priority. Then it goes to a second conversation. Shabbos candles versus Kiddush wine. Shabbos candles take priority because of peace in the home. The Rambam fudges them into one. Shabbos candles versus Chanukah candles. Shabbos candles take priority. And Kiddush wine versus Shabbos candles. Shabbos candles take priority. Why? Because peace in the home takes priority. So we need to understand, why did the Gemara feel that it was necessary to put them into two separate groups, two separate conversations? Kiddush wine is one thing, Chanukah candles is another thing. And why did the Rambam, on the other hand, feel that it could all be dealt with in one foul swoop? Also, a one-word difference that could actually make a massive difference. The Lashon HaGemara is ner beisoy adif, and the Rambam is meshane und schreibt ner beisoy koidem. The other major distinction over here, even though it's a one-word distinction, is that the Gemara uses the expression that Shabbos candles are priority, and the Rambam uses the expression that Shabbos candles take precedence. Now, in English, you're not going to hear a major distinction there. But in legal terminology, there is an important distinction. Again, the one says it takes priority, that implies that it's more important, and the other says it takes precedence, which means it's first on the list. Not necessarily because it's more important. Could be for another reason, that it has to take precedence, might be for a practical reason. So we have to understand that too. Okay, so what do we want to know? We want to know, why does the Rambam feel it necessary to bring proofs to his argument that Shalom Bayis is so important, that peace in the home is so important, therefore Shabbos candles override both Chanukah candles and Kiddush wine. We also have to understand why, in addition to bringing a proof, he then goes off on the tangent and has a whole conversation about how important peace is, and that the whole purpose of the Torah is for peace, etc. Then we had to understand who says that the logic actually works, that just because you could erase Hashem's name to save a marriage in crisis, therefore Shabbos candles automatically trump Chanukah candles. Who says? And then we have to understand the distinctions in language between the Rambam and his source in the Gemara, where the Gemara speaks about these two subjects as if they're two separate subjects, and the Rambam makes them one, Kiddush wine and Chanukah candles. And why is it that the Gemara uses the expression adif, which implies priority, and the Rambam uses the word koidem, which implies precedence? Okay. So when you've got questions like this, what do? Do you list them? Say, question 1, answer 1. Question 2, answer 2. You could do that. And that's I suppose, a genuine, authentic approach. But it's not the approach that we take when we learn Chassidus. The approach that we take is we say, well, hang on a second. If you want to understand what's going on over here, perhaps you have to understand a greater picture of the entire context within which we're talking. So that takes us to Gimel, the second column on page 373, the paragraph that starts with the letter Gimel. Vet men das verstehen behaktim. In order to understand all of these questions, to answer all of these questions, behaktim, we first have to introduce something very important. Sis Yodua, as euch der Ort, wo der Rambam stellt herein aloches, is bediuk. Now, this should have actually, and maybe you did think of it, by the way, this should have been a question that popped up in our head right at the beginning. Anybody who's familiar with the style of the Rambam would know straight away that this is a big question. The Rambam is incredibly precise, like all good classic Jewish works are. The wording is precise, the design is precise. By the way, just as a small tangent, but to give you context, so the Rambam writes 14 volumes of Jewish law. It is the most comprehensive work of Jewish law that exists. I mean, it's not the same as Gemara. Gemara is more volumes and more text, but the Gemara is not only telling us the laws. The Gemara will do the investigation behind the laws, the research, the argument, the debate, the understanding, the philosophy. It talks about spiritual matters, includes stories. The Rambam is just simply law. It is the most comprehensive book of Jewish law that exists, 14 volumes. And the way that he does it is so precise and so beautifully constructed that you actually have to learn it from start to finish to really appreciate what's going on. So people will sometimes use the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam's work, as a reference book for research, but it's not really the way to do it because he builds concepts. And everything that he places in the correct place for not just the understanding of that particular law, but to appreciate the context and even to appreciate laws that are coming in the future. So where the Rambam discusses a topic is in itself a topic. Not only what the topic is, not only what the law is, not only why the law is, but where he discusses it is always relevant. Stellt sich der Scheile. If that's the case, there's a glaring question over here. Was hat gestellt dem Din as ner Beisoi is koidem le ner Chanukah in Hilches Chanukah, nicht in Hilches Shabbos? There is a glaring question over here. What does the Rambam teach us in this particular section? Actually, if you summarize it into one phrase, what is the Rambam's main teaching in this piece? How important Shabbos candles are. Okay, so isn't the most logical place to discuss that in the laws of Shabbos candles? Why are we talking about it in the laws of Chanukah candles? Right? Logically, this conversation should have happened earlier in the same book. So this discussion belongs to the book called Zmanim. Zmanim is all the special dates on the Jewish calendar, which the Rambam follows through in order and explains what all of the laws associated with each of the special dates is, which is the first date that he discusses, Shabbos. One of the last that he discusses is Chanukah, for obvious reasons, because Chanukah is a rabbinic festival. So first you deal with the most frequent one, Shabbos, which is Torah mandated. Then you go through all the other festivals that are mandated by the Torah, Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Tov in general, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. Then you get to the ones that are rabbinic, Purim and Chanukah. So by the time he talks about Chanukah candles, we're a long way away from where he originally spoke about Shabbos candles. Now you're telling me how important Shabbos candles are? Now you wake up? Why now? So you'll say, well, because the discussion at hand over here is a discussion that would only happen when it's Shabbos on Chanukah. On a normal Shabbos, you don't have the debate, do I buy Shabbos candles or Chanukah candles? Obviously not. It's obviously only an issue that arises maximum once a year, maximum twice a year, like this year where Shabbos is the first day of Chanukah. So, okay, maximum twice a year, you'll have this question, do I prioritize my Chanukah candles or my Shabbos candles? Okay, so we get it. So that might be a logical reason to have the conversation now in the laws of Chanukah. Nor b'Shabbos Chanukah is the only time you tackle this is a Shabbos that coincides with Chanukah. But still, the bottom line is that this law illustrates the potency and the value of Shabbos candles. As die Meile von der Beiser Shabbos is koidem le ner Chanukah, hat es liche eure gedarft schreiben bei Hilches Shabbos. If the bottom line that will emerge is a lesson in the greatness and priority of Shabbos candles, then the best place to have said this would have been in the laws of Shabbos candles. Whichever way you look at it, you're selling me Shabbos candles. You're telling me the point and the purpose of Shabbos candles. So talk about it in Shabbos candles. Not only that, it gets better. Die Tmia, see where we are, this paragraph over here, on the left-hand column. Die Tmia wird noch starker, Mitzadem zweiten din ner beisoi v'kiddush hayoim. And if you thought that that was a big question, the question only escalates when you start to say, hey, hang on a second, not only are we talking about Shabbos candles versus Chanukah candles, which you can kind of justify, oh, that's why we're talking about it in the Chanukah laws. We're also talking about the distinction, the toss-up, between Shabbos candles and Kiddush wine. Was hat in ganzen kein Scheiches nicht zu Hilches Chanukah. If you're talking about Kiddush wine has got nothing to do with Chanukah. It's not on the topic. No blois zu Hilches Shabbos. It is only relevant to the laws of Shabbos. Und bringt in Donor Agav dem ersten Din ner Beisav and ner Chanukah. In fact, the only reason Kiddush wine is mentioned over here in this conversation is, by the way, because we're talking about the choices of how to prioritize Shabbos candles versus Chanukah candles, that made us discover that, you know what, there's a similar conversation around Kiddush wine. But is it core to the laws of Chanukah? Not at all. Is it part of the laws of Chanukah? Not at all. Ist doch noch mehr mistaver, als hat beide Dinim gedarft reinstellen bilche Shabbos und nicht in Hilches Chanukah. Don't you think that the most rational, most logical way to have the whole conversation should have been in the laws of Shabbos? Tell me that on Shabbos we light Shabbos candles. If you have a debate, do I afford my Shabbos candles or do I pay for my Kiddush wine? I'll prioritize Shabbos candles. Oh, by the way, now that we're discussing priorities, if it so happens that Shabbos and Chanukah, you don't have enough money for both, then you prioritize your Shabbos candles. That would have been the most logical way to do it. Raise the subject in the context of Shabbos, speak about it with issues that relate to Shabbos Kiddush wine, and then add on the detail about Chanukah. Why on earth did the Rambam leave such an important conversation, Kiddush wine versus Shabbos candles, until it comes up in the laws of Chanukah, where it seems to just be kind of a sidebar? Noch mehr. It gets better. The question gets stronger. In Turuv Shulchan Aruch gefindt men takke dem din as ner Shabbos is koidem lener Chanukah in beide Erte, sei in Ilches Shabbos und sei in Ilches Chanukah. The next stage of halachic evolution after the Rambam would be the books of the Tur, written by Rabbi Yaakov Baal HaTurim, who was effectively the first person to collate out of the Rambam's massive encyclopedia. I don't want to say the first person, there were others as well, but was a critical person to collate out of that encyclopedia laws that are relevant to today. The Rambam discusses laws that were relevant in the time of the temple and laws that will be relevant in the time of Mashiach. So we got to kind of distill that down into things that are relevant in our lives, the Tur, and then based on the Tur we have the building of the Shulchan Aruch, which is our go-to book of Code of Jewish Law. So you look in both the Tur and the Shulchan Aruch, and you will see that they discuss these deliberations around Shabbos candles and Kiddush wine, or Shabbos candles and Chanukah candles, twice. They record these laws in the laws of Shabbos, and they also record these laws in the laws of Chanukah. Now that makes sense. What the Rambam has done doesn't seem to make sense. So you'll say, okay, but the Rambam is not like the Shulchan Aruch, and the Rambam does not typically put one law into two different cases. Okay? And this is something I alluded to a little bit earlier, so we'll come back to it right now. Like the Rambam spells out in his general rules of how the book works, Zayin derech is, his approach is usually leforesh dvarav v'mokem echad, so same dvarav. That effectively what the Rambam often does is he expresses something very clearly in one place and he leaves it unstated or open-ended in a different place. In other words, he doesn't repeat the same information multiple times. Why not? Because generally speaking, the way the Rambam works is that if he's taught us something earlier, he doesn't feel the need to repeat it. You should remember it from when you learned it originally. Even if you don't remember it, you should remember that you did learn it so you can go back and you can consult. So that's why, as I was saying earlier, that's why it's not really ideal to study the Rambam as a reference book. Oh, I want to look up what the Rambam has to say on a particular topic, because you may not be able to find all the relevant information, because he builds whatever he's teaching on that topic based on things that he's taught about preceding topics. And you might be completely unfamiliar with those preceding topics, and you'll come out with the wrong idea of what the Rambam actually says. So in any event, if you want to say the Shulchan Aruch may choose occasionally to repeat the same information more than once, but the Rambam doesn't, fine. Maschenkin in Turbo Shulchan Aruch findet man nicht Odem Kral, weil der Rambam Knal bin Nidan as es steht zweimal. Okay, so if you want to say that the Rambam doesn't necessarily repeat himself, I'm going to skip the brackets just in the interest of time. We'll come back to, please God, I hope I remember next week, come back to the brackets. So do you see where we are? The paragraph that's just above Dalet. Even if it's true that the Rambam, generally speaking, does not repeat information more than once because he relies on what is already explained earlier, that's not going to work here. You cannot say that that's what's happening here, that the Rambam will explain something in one place, and then rely in the other place that you already know it. That can't work here. For a logical reason. Usually, if you explain something once and expect us to know it for the next time, you'll obviously explain it the first time the topic arises. Here, the Rambam glosses over it the first time that it arises in Shabbos, and he only starts to talk about it over here in Chanukah. Or befrat, as das was ner Shabbos is durch ner Chanukah is madgish v'chulei Shabbos v'chulei. Sorry, canal. Okay, so sorry, I skipped a line. Logically, then the place where the Rambam should have addressed this should have been in the laws of Shabbos, which come first. And of course, as we've already said, it seems that the emphasis is wrong. Here we're emphasizing the greatness of the laws of Shabbos candles, and yet we're talking about it in the context of Chanukah candles. Okay, so let's try and summarize what's going on over here. You joined this shir thinking, wow, it looks like an interesting topic. We're talking about Chanukah, and we're talking about Shabbos, and we're talking about peace in the home, and it sounds really interesting. In the meantime, we've gotten into all this technical detail. Don't worry, the technical detail is just to build a case that's going to teach us an absolutely beautiful insight into peace in the home and Shabbos and Chanukah. But so far what we have is there's a string of questions on the Rambam. Why does the Rambam seem to include information that apparently isn't necessary? All these proofs about how important peace is. Why does the Rambam use different language from the Gemara? And the big question is, why does the Rambam talk about how great Shabbos candles is when he's actually talking about Chanukah candles? It's kind of like a little bit of a slap in the face to the Chanukah candles, don't you think? Okay, everybody, here are the laws of Chanukah candles. They're really, really, really important. But Shabbos candles are even much more important. So that's what we have to understand. And as we put this together and as we try and construct it, we'll come out with an insight into Chanukah, Shabbos, and the principle of peace in the home.